All of you guys looking to put on muscle are going to like this interview. Dr. Layne Norton is infamous in the bodybuilding community for being one of the most well-known and respected natural bodybuilders in the world. We thought we'd chat with him about the best tips and strategies to pack on muscle to an ectomorph frame. You might be surprised at what he says. Here's the introduction. Alright guys, today we're talking to Dr. Layne Norton. Now, this guy probably needs no introduction. You probably already know him, but in case you haven't heard of him yet, he's the owner of Layne. He's a natural pro bodybuilder and pro powerlifter. He's got a PhD in nutritional sciences. He's a columnist for Muscular Development, consultant for Citations and bodybuilding.com. And like I said, he's probably the most well-known and respected natural bodybuilder on the internet. So thank you, Dr. Layne, for joining us today, man.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So the theme or the premise of what we're talking about today is the best way for ectomorphs or hard gainers to get huge. So if some actor from Hollywood came up to you and was like, "Hey, I'm this skinny dude. I need to get huge for a role in a couple months. What do I do?"
Well, I mean, I think that there's I think the term hard gainer gets tossed around quite a bit. I'd probably tell most people that almost everybody's a hard gainer because, muscle, it just takes time to build. I mean, there are a few, everybody knew the guy in high school who, never really lifted and looked jacked, you know what I mean? But those are pretty few and far between. Most of us have to work pretty hard to build muscle. I think that when you're talking about, what's going to work best for this person or what's going to work best for that person, typically it doesn't change the rules in terms of what works. What changes is the scale of the response that you're going to get. Okay. So if you take somebody who has really good genetics and responds really well, they're going to respond really well, whereas somebody who doesn't have the good genetics not going to respond really well. It doesn't necessarily change what you're going to have to do in terms of, a lot of the high-intensity training guys kind of made their stake saying, "Oh, well, this training is for ectomorphs, or this training is for hard gainers," and I really think that's kind of bogus, to be quite honest with you. I think that typically hard gainers, we tend to think of kind of the hard gainers as like the ectomorphs, the very very slender builds like that, and so usually what you're dealing with is somebody who has a very fast metabolism, who honestly most of the problem is they just need to really eat more. And I keep saying, "Oh, well, Layne, I eat 4,000 calories a day." Okay, well, if you aren't gaining anything, it's not enough. You know what I mean? You got to eat more. I think sometimes one of the problems we have is people almost try to gain too fast, and you'll have like the skinny fat syndrome, where like somebody will, they'll start bulking and they'll be skinny, but then they'll start getting a little bit of pudge. And so, well, the thing is, they'll put on, 12 pounds in a month or something like that, and they'll wonder why they got pudgy. Well, you can only add, the amount of muscle that you can add, the amount of amino acids that you can actually deposit in muscle per day, so the amount of tissue you can actually build we're talking about on the gram scale. It's like 5 to 10 grams a day is what you can build. And so, like, if you take that, you extend it out over a year, and you look at, the fluid that's associated with that tissue and everything, it ends up about the most you're going to be able to gain. And I'm not saying this is the natural limit or anything like that, because everybody's different, and, for every rule, there's the exception that proves the rule. But typically, the most you're going to be able to put on is 20-25 pounds of lean body mass in a year. And so, if you got these guys, these hard gainers, a lot of them will say, "Well, my goal is to add, 50 pounds of mass this year, or 30 pounds of mass this year." And when I say 20 or 25, I'm talking about if everything goes perfectly right, which usually it doesn't, And so I really think a lot of it comes down to just patience. A lot of people say they have trouble gaining muscle, but I very rarely see somebody who's been hitting it hard for 10 years and doesn't look pretty darn good. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of it is just like being able to be persistent and not get discouraged. You talk about Hollywood actors, they'll put on a lot of muscle or whatnot. Typically what happens is they didn't necessarily put on a lot of muscle, they just cut off a lot of fat. I mean, to be honest, the best way to look like you gain 10 pounds of muscle is to lose 10 pounds of fat. Every time I start dieting for Down for Contest, and I'll post pictures up, and everybody goes, "Oh my God, you got so big, you got way bigger." No, I'm actually, 10, 15 pounds lighter. It's just I look, the muscle stands out more, you look more muscular. So I guess I really didn't give you much of in the way of a substantive answer. It was more of a philosophical type answer. But that's my opinion, is that, you know, what works for, you know, quote unquote, the regular population is going to work for hard gainers too. It just might take them a little bit longer. They might not have as good of a response. And it might just take them longer to see the same amount of results as a normal person would see. But I think a lot of it just boils down to persistence and perseverance. I mean, I never called myself a hard gainer. I got called that by other people who said, you know, my genetics were terrible or this or that. I mean, it's so funny. When I first started bodybuilding, everybody told me, one, you can't do it. You'll never do anything with it. And two, your genetics are terrible. And magically, 10 years later, suddenly I have great genetics. And I must have been using drugs to do it, because there's no way I got that way naturally, you know. Again, it's one of those things where when you've done something for, you know, 10 years, you know, you're typically going to be pretty good at the end of it. So I guess my advice to people out there that have that problem is, you know, really just be persistent and stick with it.
We've kind of learned already then that, like, just because you're an ectomorph or you're a different type of body type, it doesn't mean you need to train differently. It just means your response to optimal training is going to be different from other body types.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and I do think training is going to vary a little bit from person to person. I think that, you know, undulating periodization training has kind of been shown to be basically the most consistently best form of training for strength and hypertrophy. And basically that's the premise of undulating periodization, is that, you know, there's basically 3 different ways you can train with resistance training, and that's for strength, for hypertrophy, I guess you could say endurance too, but whatever, we'll leave that out. Because endurance training is going to make you worse at strength training. So strength, hypertrophy, and then power. And power is a measure of, you know, not necessarily like a heavy weight, but how fast can you, like 40 to 60% of a 1 rep max, but moving it fast. So we're talking about like explosive power.
Okay.
So those 3 things. And the premises of undulating periodization is that you never maximize any one of those outcomes. So even without doing all 3, some of all 3. So if you're a power lifter, you still need to do hypertrophy work, because if you don't, you'll never maximize cross-sectional area and you'll never maximize your actual strength. If you're a track athlete, you still need to do some powerlifting with heavy loads, because you will still never maximize your power output if you don't maximize your strength. If you don't do some strength training. Mm-hmm. And if you're a bodybuilder, you still need to do, you know, strength training, maximum effort training, because if you don't do power training, you won't maximize your hypertrophy. So it's just, now when you're wanting to focus on one or the other of those, you just switch your emphasis. So if you're a bodybuilder, you're primarily going to do hypertrophy, but you should add in some strength training sessions, some power sessions. If you're going to train for strength, you should do hypertrophy, you should do power, but you should mostly do strength sessions. So you're just changing the emphasis where it goes. So that's, you know, I do believe in undulating periodization, or nonlinear periodization, is kind of the best ways to get results. And that's kind of how I developed, you know, well, I'm not going to say I developed the power hypertrophy adaptive training system, because it was basically me taking information from a bunch of other people. I didn't make anything new. I just kind of made it a little bit more palatable for people, a little bit something they didn't feel like they needed a bachelor's degree to read.
Yeah.
But that's basically what it's based on, is nonlinear undulating periodization. But I do think that different people respond differently to different programs as well, and you need to be able to kind of understand how your body. Let me give you an example for that. There was a study done in Sweden where they looked at different rep ranges and the hormonal responses that people got. So like how much their testosterone spiked after training in response to these different rep ranges. And they found that some people got better responses from high rep training, some people got better responses from low rep training. Okay? And so they took the people that got, whatever somebody got their best response from, they put them on that training protocol. And they got really good results for 6 weeks. Then they crossed them over. So if you got your best response on a low rep training protocol, they put you on a high rep, and vice versa. And what they found is when they did that, they got significantly worse results. Okay, just in 6 weeks' times. So, yes, there definitely is something you need to know what works for you, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you should completely eliminate all other forms of training. I think that's where I think people make mistakes by doing that. I think all forms of training have kind of merit. I just think it's a matter of, scale, how you do it, how much of it you do, and how often you incorporate it. So I think one of the problems is a lot of the coaches and gurus out there, we get to the point where, like, we have all this information out there, and we're more so defending a political position than actually trying to, like, find out what the best for somebody is. Mm-hmm. And, you find people they're trying to fit a person to their system instead of trying to fit their system to a person. You know what I mean? And so I think that, you need to try out different things. You need to find what works for you. I mean, I don't follow a straight power hypertrophy adaptive training. The example that's online, I don't follow that necessarily straight up. I've changed things to tweak it for myself. So you need to, it's okay to start out with like a basic outline of different training programs, but you need to work with stuff. You need to tweak stuff. You need to, and be willing to, I mean, trial and error is really huge in bodybuilding and in powerlifting, and everybody wants to know, what's going to be the best for me right now. But you got to put the work in. You got to understand it. And I think that a lot of people also have, like, paralysis by analysis. I talk about this a lot. Like, you'll see these guys online who they, like, stress over every minute detail, and they never actually go do anything. Like, they're like, okay, what do you think of my routine? What do you think of my routine? They put out these like 15 different routines, and then they never actually do anything. And it's like, dude, I always tell people this: the worst laid plan executed today is better than the best laid plan executed too late. Okay, yeah. Like I said, if you lift really hard for 10 years and even have no idea what you're doing, but you lift really hard for 10 years, you're gonna look pretty good at the end of it if you're just consistent with it. So I think that's important to note that, really, like, that's because everybody will say, oh, well, Layne, you always say work out a body part at least 2-3 times a week, but look at this guy, he works out with it 1 time a week, and he looks great. I'm not saying you can't get results that way. What I'm saying is that guy would probably look even better if he had a more optimal training program. Because, like I said, you can always find the exception that proves the rule. Everybody can find a guy who eats 3 meals at McDonald's and looks awesome. So if that would be disaster for most people. You know what I mean? But that doesn't necessarily make it optimal for most people.
Is there like a good starting point though, where someone could, because obviously they're gonna have to experiment with different programs. But is there a good general idea? Like, should everyone start with like a 5-day split, or should everyone start with a 3-day split? Like, is there one or the other that's probably going to be a bit more optimal?
I hear a lot of people say, oh, you should start with a 3-day, full body split if you're starting out or something like that. And that's probably fine. But, I think, I honestly, part of it too, that I tell people a lot is I think that you need to do a program. You have the best program in the world, but if you don't like it, you're not going to work hard at it. And it's going to get you suboptimal results. So at the end of the day, yes, it needs to be a properly constructed program, but you also need to enjoy it as well. And like for a long time, I stopped enjoying my bodybuilding training. Well, I wouldn't say I stopped enjoying it. It was stale. Like, I just got old with it. That's when I picked up powerlifting. And everybody kept saying, well, you're going to get all these suboptimal results with powerlifting. And I got great results with powerlifting because it really motivated me, because I was like excited to go into the gym and be doing something new and trying something different. And I still kept aspects of my bodybuilding training in there. I mean, I kind of figure, I don't know anybody who's gotten small lifting heavy weights, you know what I mean? But just that, I think people underestimate the psychological factor, the motivation factor of getting a routine that's fresh, something they enjoy, something they can keep doing. And so I think that's an important thing too. So if somebody wants to start out with a 5-day split, I think that's fine. If they want to start with a 3-day split, I think that's fine. Whatever kind of fits their schedule. Whatever. For a beginner, it's almost more about like what motivates them and what's going to keep them in the gym consistently. Because after you've been doing it for 5 years, most people aren't going to suddenly up and one day say, I quit. This is not for me. You've been doing it for that long, you kind of love it already and you're into it. But when you're first getting started, I think whatever you enjoy, what motivates you is going to be best. I mean, I think, if I had to pick out specific, well, pardon me, you're not boring me, I'm just tired.
Right.
if I had to pick out like specific routines, you know, like strong lifts, you know, 5x5, you know, some of those, you know, I mean, they're cookie cutter routines, but they're typically starting strength. You know, they'll typically give you a decent, you know, base to start off with to get used to. You know, I am a believer in that, you know, you do need to learn how to squat. You do need to learn how to deadlift. And when you start out, you're probably going to be pretty awful at those things. I mean, think about, you know, first time you ever tried to, you know, throw a football or something like that. I mean, you know, if you try to throw a football the first time, it didn't come out a perfect spiral, most likely. You know, it's pretty terrible. It takes time to get used to, you know, people don't think about weightlifting as a skill. They just think about, oh, you lift weights. But it's a skill. I mean, if I show you somebody who's just in the gym just doing squats, and I show you like an elite power lifter and the way they do squats, it's like watching a rabid dog chase a ball versus watching a machine. You know what I mean? Like something that's just automatic, you know? Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, that's kind of discounted too, just the practicing element of things. I realize I'm going off on a tangent here, but I always get these things going in my mind. One of the things, there's a powerlifting coach at the gym I train at, and he's a real good guy. And one of the things he says is you want to treat heavyweight like it's light and lightweight like it's heavy. And he always tells that to his kid. He trains a lot of teenagers. He always tells that to the kids because the kids will be in there warming up, and they'll just have, you know, easy weight in the bar, and they'll just be going through their warm-ups real quick. And he'll say, no, slow down, practice. This is practice. You know, you got to think about, because if you're actually going to change your form, if you're actually going to improve your form, it's not going to happen when you're doing your heavy lifts, because you're going to go back to what your bad parts are.
Yep.
You know, so in that way, it's like a skill. You know, they say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at anything. So if you want to get good at lifting weights, it's going to take 10,000 hours of it for you to get good at it. So, you know, think about that when you're starting out, and, you know, don't shy away from the big lifts because you're intimidated by them, but realize that it's going to take you a while and a learning curve to get proficient at them.
Okay. What do you think about, like you mentioned HIIT earlier, and, you know, the book Body by Science by Doug McGuff, I believe his name is.
Okay.
Have you heard of that book?
It sounds vaguely familiar. There's a lot of books out there. You have to forgive me.
Okay, well, it's basically on that whole concept, but the book itself is like, it's all based on scientific studies that show that the HIIT methodology of working out is like the optimal way to produce results.
HIIT training?
Yeah, HIIT, like the whole like thing that Mike Menser switched to, where he was only training like once or twice a week. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd really like to see the science they're basing that off of, because based on the meta-analysis that I've read and that most of the scientific community agrees on, is that the one variable, if you look at intensity, if you look at frequency, if you look at time under tension, volume, you want to start picking out the variables we talk most about when we're talking about you know, things that produce hypertrophy. Volume is the number one variable associated with hypertrophy. It's not intensity. And so now people will take that and say, well, you know, you're saying I should go out and do 50 sets. That's not what I'm saying. My point being is that's the variable that's most associated with hypertrophy. And I've seen very, very few studies that suggest that high-intensity training is the optimal way to produce results. In fact, I can't say I've seen one study that suggests that. I think what happens is a lot of people, when they first start off and they're not used to training, they will overreach. I don't call it overtraining because people think overtraining is a term that gets used a lot, and really overtraining is not something. It's more of a whole body central nervous system problem. It's not something intrinsic to the muscle. You know, the idea that of overtraining that most people have is that you train muscle to the point where it becomes so overtrained it's catabolic. Nobody's ever shown that, ever. They've shown, you know, that you can have problems with hormone levels, with really high volume loads of training. Usually in people who are like Ironman or marathon runners. It's not typically in weight trainers. But you can still get it. I mean, if you get really, really heavy and really, really high volume, you can get overtraining. But I call it overreaching because the Russians a long time ago knew that overreaching produced results, and what they would do is they would take weightlifters and they would put them through an adaptation phase, and then they would put them through an overreaching phase. We're basically purposefully, systemically overtraining them. And then after that, they would have a phase where it was super low volume, and they called it super compensation. And it was almost like a rubber band. Like if you pull a rubber band really, really far, it stretches, and then boom, it snaps back. And they would actualize, they called it actualized gains. So they would actualize their gains in that super compensation phase. Well, that's exactly what a lot of people do. If you think about when they start HIIT, they'll start do like a higher volume routine or something like that. They'll feel sore, run down, feel like they're overtrained, and then they'll switch to a high intensity, like a lower volume routine, and they'll start making gains, and they will associate those gains with that lower volume routine. But actually what's caused it was that overreaching cycle, and it was just that low volume routine actualized their gains. So that's what allowed them to make those gains. So it's not that low volume never has a place. It does have a place, but it's after an overreaching cycle. And what happens is the problem with high intensity training as a kind of a philosophical thing, you know, if you look at it for somebody who doesn't have a background in science necessarily, and they say, well, if the very famous saying he had is, if you hammer a nail through a board once it's in, you don't have to hammer it again. Well, that's great for a hammer and a nail, but it means absolutely nothing for muscle physiology. And what happens is you only have essentially two ways that you can make progress on that program. Get stronger or do more reps, because you have one set essentially to failure. You can't get stronger forever, and you're not going to be able to keep doing more reps. You can't get more endurance forever. You can always add in more volume. Okay? And so the problem is yes, you can get results with HIIT, but you will plateau eventually to the point where you can't get over it. So again, that's one of the problems I have with it. And as far as, if somebody wrote a book saying it was scientifically based, I think they probably skipped over a few studies personally. I mean, based on the literature I've seen. Okay.
It would still be cool to check out though and see what they're referencing.
Yeah, I mean, do they actually list references in it?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other problems is, and I'm not saying I'm always right, because certainly I'm not. I've been wrong on some things. But at least in the scientific community, the strength and conditioning community, it's pretty well, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're proponents of necessarily a high volume, but it's pretty well been a consensus that multi-sets are superior to single sets in terms of producing hypertrophy or strength or what have you. So yeah, I'd be really interested to see. One of the things you have to be careful with is a lot of times, people cite things, and 99% of the time nobody ever checks those citations to make sure that what that person is citing is actually what people found in their results. Or maybe, a lot of times part of the problem is we have a whole generation of people. PubMed is great. I have what we call PubMed scientists, where they can go on PubMed and they can look at any abstract they want. The problem with looking at an abstract and to kind of determining conclusively from that is that you don't get to see how they did the study in terms of the methods. You don't actually get to see the results for yourself. All you get to see is the conclusion, their interpretation of that data. And I've been on PubMed and looked at studies and read conclusions and then gone back and looked at the actual data and said, that isn't what they found, So it's... people want to think about science as kind of black and white, and it's not. There's very much a gray area in there. It's kind of like politics. Nothing's ever black and white. Politics will try to make it out to be black and white, but it's not. Everything's in the gray area. And so things are kind of like that. So you'll very rarely say these following words: never, always, best, worst. These kind of like absolute terms. Simply because I think most things have some kind of merit. It just depends on how you implement them.
And then the other thing with PubMed is sponsorship, where it's like a study on the effectiveness of a drug sponsored by the company that produces the drug, so. Yeah,
I mean, that is a problem, but you have to think about it also like, like it's kind of a double-edged sword for a company. Like for example, so, I'm a consultant for Citations, and so it's funny because you'll see these people that complain about none of these companies actually have research to back up their product. And then when a company does research on a product, when they have favorable results, people say, "Well, you backed the study, so it's obviously bunk."
Yeah.
And it's like you can't win. So I mean certainly that can be a problem, but at the same time, like for example, my research was sponsored by the National Dairy Council and the Egg Board, and I've met one person from the Egg Board my entire life, and that was at a conference, and it was 2 years after they gave me money. So I never had anybody from the Egg Board like looking over my shoulder in lab, like you better make sure that sample goes in there, you know what I mean? So. Yeah. It can, where your money's coming from, it might influence your interpretations of the data, but, I would like to think most scientists out there have, a lot of integrity. Obviously, there's definitely some who flat out make up stuff. But, yeah, I mean, it can be a double-edged sword, because you want to incentivize companies to do this research to show that their products are effective, but at the same time, that's going to be the major criticism is that they sponsor the research. So it's kind of, I for the most part, I tell people, take it with a grain of salt then. If you don't believe it, then don't believe it. But at least they're trying to, put some money into doing research. I mean, I can say for a fact after, for originally being a sponsored athlete, and this is going to sound like a plug, but after being a sponsored athlete with Citations and not really knowing the inner workings of the company and now being a consultant, and getting to see how they do stuff, I can say, pretty confidently that they have a lot of integrity, and they will, and I say this because I'm sure other companies like this too. Everybody thinks about the supplement industry as being, all shady, and they're done. The people that are at the top of Citations, they've always said, okay, well we don't, they're actually putting more money into a study that they've. They had some trouble with a study, and I can't really say what, but they had some trouble with a study, and they're actually putting more money into it without the benefit of necessarily knowing they're going to get the results they want, and they're sinking more money into it just because they want. The owner actually said, "I want to know the science. I want to know if this works, because if it doesn't work, I don't want to market it." And so I think a lot of people would just say, "Well, the hell if it doesn't work, we're going to market the heck out of it, and we're going to put it out there." So. I think there are some companies out there like that, and I think I think unfortunately a few bad eggs spoil it for everybody. I tend to think that most people are actually good and decent for the most part, but my wife also says I'm kind of naive, so I don't know.
Well, that kind of brings us into supplements though. Like, are there certain supplements that are just like, obviously whey protein is probably a staple for most people. But even getting into like timing, should someone just be having a whey protein shake after their workout? Should they have? I've heard of studies where they say it's best to have one before and one after, or one before, one during, stuff like that. Is there anything like that you know about?
I mean, first off, I'll say that I think whey protein is one of the highest quality protein sources, if not the highest quality protein source, and it's great. I also would say that I think there's nothing wrong with whole food either. I'm also not like, it seems like there's like a shake camp and then like a whole food camp, and you can't ever mix the two. I think both are fine. I don't think you necessarily have to have a shake post workout. There's studies that have shown. There was a study by who was it? Stuart Phillips at McMaster, where they looked at egg protein post workout, and they got a really good response. The only difference is if you're doing, whey's a little bit higher quality, so you can probably use less and get the same response as something like egg or, another protein source. I just think whey is, one, it's convenient, two, it's pretty inexpensive, and three, it tastes good. So I think for most people, a lot of people, it's a convenience factor. Me personally, I actually just take a free-form branched chain amino acid supplement after my workout, right after I'm done, and then I just eat whole food when I get home, because I know that branched chain amino acid supplement, it's not like it's going to go through me in 30 minutes or anything like that. So I just do that and have a whole food meal when I get home. Or you can do a whey shake post-workout. I think either one's fine. I think that's, that gets down to like the 0.5% difference over the course of time. It's it's just we're splitting hairs. But I mostly tell for people with like whey protein shakes, just consume it as you need protein, and whether that's one time a day or maybe you're traveling and you need to take one 3 times a day, it's not going to hurt you. And it's a high quality, convenient protein source. I mean, I think it's definitely one of the best things you can buy in terms of bang for your buck.
Okay, and creatine as well, creatine monohydrate.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about supplements that have actual data to show their effectiveness, I mean, creatine's got a mountain of data. A lot of people will say, well, it didn't work for me or whatnot, and that's probably valid. It seems like about 30% of people aren't responders, and that's basically because essentially what the science has shown is that the way creatine works is it increases your intramuscular levels of creatine, okay, or creatine phosphate specifically. And once you get to a saturation point with that, that's where you actualize the benefits of creatine, is by saturating your muscle cells with creatine phosphate. Well, people who, if they naturally have high levels of creatine, if you only take it from, let's just arbitrarily say 95% saturated to 100% saturated, you probably won't notice much of a difference. But if you're only, say, 50%, you take it to 100%, you're probably going to notice a huge difference. So I think that's why you see some people get really, really, really good results out of creatine, and others don't get hardly anything at all. I think, and as far as specifics, I mean, I would tell people don't buy anything other than creatine monohydrate. It's what's been proven in research. Nothing else has ever been shown to be as effective as creatine monohydrate. The reason you're seeing all these new creatines come out every single week is because that's what companies can market. I mean, that's what, they can make a higher gain on. And I'm not saying those products don't work. They probably do work, but they're, twice as expensive as creatine monohydrate. And they'll say things like, my favorite is, oh, well, it doesn't cause water retention. You're going to retain water inside the muscle cell with creatine. That's the point of creatine. That's one of the most anabolic properties of creatine. So if a company says, well, our creatine doesn't cause water retention, ask them, are they saying their creatine is not anabolic? And see what they say, because that's basically what they're saying. So, a lot of people will they'll confuse water retention inside the muscle cell with like bloating and gas. Mm-hmm. And that's a GI problem. That's usually people who have that problem is they're loading a large amount of creatine at the beginning, and you can only absorb about, 5 grams of creatine per day or something close to that. And so like if you're taking in 20, you're going to saturate the muscle cells a little faster, but you're also going to have all this undigested creatine sitting in your intestine, and that's going to cause you to have gas, bloating, all these things. So if you're one of these people who has those responses, try not loading, just start off taking the maintenance dose and stay on that. And, over time, you'll still get the muscle cells saturated and you'll still get the same results.
Okay. And what about diet? There's the paleo community that they're like, this is the best way to eat. And there's some science that supports that, right? But
yeah,
is there like an optimal way? Obviously, it's going to be like an individual prescription for everyone. But is there a good template that a hard gainer or an ectomorph, for someone that's not gaining muscle because they're not eating enough, is there a good template for them to take? Like, can they just start eating pizza, like Dave Tate might say?
Well, as far as, I'll just use paleo as an example. I'm not trying to pick on paleo people or anything. Paleo is an example of a great concept with, solid principles that has gotten taken to the extreme by zealots. And I'm probably going to get some Twitter messages of angry people over this, but basically, the principles of it are fine. More protein, more fiber, more vegetables, more fruits, less refined grains. If you can take that and get 90% of the population to do that, we'd be a heck of a lot better off. But the problem is now you have these people who are like, you got to eat just like a caveman. So if it's not organically grown beef, and if it didn't come from the ground, if you didn't grow the ground, the cattle you raised yourself on, and then cut the beef off yourself, it's not any good. It's like, come on, all right. There's a middle ground here. The same thing. They'll say, don't eat any dairy, don't eat any gluten. Gluten's evil and all this stuff. there's probably, 20-30% of the population that have mild dairy and gluten sensitivities. And if you're part of that population, you probably shouldn't eat it, or at least restrict it. But if you tolerate that stuff, fine. There's no reason you can't have it. Just, my real problem conceptually comes from the idea that, okay, yes, cavemen may have eaten this way, but last time I checked, cavemen weren't trying to get as jacked as possible. Okay? So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. Yeah, I think it's an example. A lot of these diets are examples of good principles that have been taken to the extreme by people who don't know how to kind of have that middle ground that I've been talking about. As far as like what I think is good for ectomorphs, I'll be honest, I've dealt with some extremely fast metabolisms when I've been coaching people. I had a guy, and it was incredible. He could eat 700 grams of carbs a day and he couldn't gain weight. He was eating like 5,500 calories and he apparently could gain weight. And I eventually just told him, look, dude, if you got to start eating some pizza or something to just get enough, because at that point, like, he's just so miserable from eating such a high volume of quote unquote clean foods that it's just he can't, like, it's just not feasible to add any more food in. So I just told him, I'm like, look, go out and go to Chipotle and get a burrito, or go to get a pizza or whatever. Not eat as much as you can, but fit it into your macronutrient targets. And when you're eating 700 grams of carbs a day and 200 grams of fat, you can fit it into your macronutrient targets. But if you're somebody with a slower metabolism who, your macronutrient targets are more like, 250 grams of carbs a day and 60 grams of fat, well, then pizza isn't going to be on the menu, you know what I mean? Unless you're only having like one slice. So I really think nutrition is a very, very individualized thing. And, since the kind of the spotlight's on the hard gainers, I would say that, typically hard gainers can get away with a little bit more carbohydrate intake. They tend to be, a little bit more carb tolerant, a little bit more insulin sensitive. So, I would say, actually, make sure you're getting enough protein. If you're getting a gram per pound, that's, pretty solid amount. But don't overdo the protein. Those people say eat 2 grams per pound of body weight of protein. I think that's pretty ludicrous. There's absolutely no data that suggests that's any better than 1.5 grams per pound. And since protein actually has kind of a thermogenic effect, if you're a hard gainer who burns a lot of calories anyway, if you're taking in all this extra protein, now you're burning even more calories because it's thermogenic, and you're actually it's a less efficient source of calories for you. So a lot of times with the really extreme ectomorphs, I'll back them off quite a bit on their protein intake because they're taking really high protein intakes in, and I'll up their carbs and fat, and they'll start growing when I do that. So I'm not saying you should eat low protein. I'm just saying not ridiculously high.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I just think it's important to keep everything in balance, and a lot of times, again, like I've been saying, that whole concept of a middle ground, or kind of a happy medium. So, if you got a guy who's 150 pounds, and he's having trouble gaining weight, well, maybe then, 150 grams of protein a day, and you push the carbs and fat up a little more. And, I always tell people, like, look, start in the lower end of the calorie range. And if you aren't gaining weight, if like you go through a month and you've only gained, a pound, well, if you want to push it up a little bit, then slowly start adding calories in. But it's easy to keep fat off. It's harder to take fat off once it's on than just not put it on in the first place. Okay? So just, people get impatient and they want gains now, and that's why they tend to, that's what these people that overbulk, it tends to be from getting impatient and just wanting to see the number on the scale move up just for the sake of seeing the number on the scale move up. But I really recommend, just starting out a little bit lower, and then slowly adding calories in until it starts to move at the appropriate pace.
Okay. Now, as far as those ectomorph clients you had, did you find that there was a certain style of training that either you kind of went to by default with them first of all, or a type of training that you found they all responded best to, or was it very individualized?
It's pretty individualized. It's like what I talked about before, that, they would get results from what most people got results from, which is, the properly periodized routines, but it was just a difference of scale, Most people I've worked with, I'd say 70-80% who had been on, low frequency typical bodybuilding splits, when I put them on a properly periodized routine, they saw pretty significant increases in strength and hypertrophy compared to before. I'd say, 70 or 80% of them would definitely agree. And then, the other 20%, I think they probably didn't follow it. But no, I mean, I won't go that far, but I would say that, like I said, I think that mostly people respond to, kind of the same things, but it's a difference of scale and a difference of where they should put their emphasis. I mean, a lot of it too is, figuring out what your weak points are and where you want to make adjustments and really putting your emphasis there. If I got a guy who's got enormous legs and no chest, well, I'm going to spend a heck of a lot more volume and frequency on his chest than I am his legs, So I think a lot of tailoring comes down to, those sorts of things. And but also listening to feedback from a client too. It's typically, there's always in genetics or science is what is called a Gaussian distribution, and that's where you basically have 80 or 90% of people fall within one range, and they don't really deviate outside that. And then you got about 2 standard deviations on each end. About 5% on each end that are kind of like these outliers. And so, typically if I get an outlier, I'll know because they'll give me feedback, because their response will just be so funky that I'll have to start changing things because their feedback is abnormal. But typically, everybody kind of likes to think they're one of the outliers, especially like the ones on the worst end, that everything's harder for them. But I would tell people that, look, gaining muscle is pretty much hard for almost anybody.
Okay. A moment ago, you talked about these guys were on a split, and then you put them on a proper periodization program. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, most bodybuilding splits aren't really periodized. It's, I'm working out chest on Monday, and I'm doing, bench press for 3 sets of 10 reps. Or then I'm doing flies for, 3 sets of 15 reps. That sort of thing. It's kind of a set routine. It doesn't really change. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about periodization, you're talking about you're going to start varying rep range. You're going to vary rest times. You're going to vary time under tension. You're going to vary volume. You're going to vary frequency. You're going to start adjusting all these different variables. And so, I don't want to call it, confusion or whatever, because that's kind of you don't confuse a muscle. A muscle doesn't get confused. But you're introducing different stimulus in it in order to keep it, in order to keep the stimulus fresh and keep the muscle responding to the training you're doing. Whereas, typical bodybuilding split may work for a little while, but because it's not properly periodized, you're going to plateau and stagnate a lot more frequently.
Yeah.
So that's so typically most people, when they've been on those sorts of things, when they get on something that's periodized, they go, whoa, wow.
Is there like a set amount of time that you will will you change every workout in a way, or will you kind of do something like keep the reps at one level or whatever for 4 weeks and then switch up then?
Well, that's actually a form of periodization. That's called linear periodization. That was how the first form of periodization. So the concept was, okay, you would do, like your first 4-week training block would be low reps, and then your first 4-week training block would be high reps, low weight, high volume, and then medium, and then low reps, heavyweight, low volume for the final 4-week training block, and that would encompass a 12-week training block. And they found that was, significantly better than, unperiodized training splits. But what they found was it wasn't as good as nonlinear periodization. And nonlinear periodization is basically you're varying it within the microcycle of training. So, for example, the power hypertrophy split is basically an example of nonlinear periodization. Early in the week, you're working out, your upper body and lower body, and you're doing low reps, lower volume, heavy weight, almost like a powerlifting style routine. And then later in the week, you're doing higher reps, higher volume, like a bodybuilding style routine. And that's why it's nonlinear, because it's going up and down like that. And what they found is that was superior because in the 4 weeks that, let's say you do your 4 weeks of low reps on your training block for linear periodization.
Right.
When you go to high reps, what they found was, even though it was better than non-periodized, you would lose some of the favorable adaptations that you made during those times you were lifting heavy weights. Mm-hmm. And then when you were doing heavy weights, you would lose some of those favorable adaptations from the high weights, high reps. So by doing it non-linear, by putting everything kind of together at the same time and just varying them within the week or within the training microcycle, you're getting the benefits of all those three different types of training at the same time, and you don't lose those adaptations over time.
Okay. So someone could try out, for example, like a 4-day type split where you do like a powerlifting lower body and a powerlifting upper body on like Monday, Tuesday, and then you do like a bodybuilder type upper body on Friday and a bodybuilder type lower body on Thursday.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly how I started out with the power hypertrophy split. Was I don't mind giving people credit. Eugene Sanic, who's actually I believe he's got his MD now, but he was a person I used to talk a lot with on various bodybuilding message boards, and this was on mindandmuscle.net, which I don't know if it's still up. It was a great forum, a lot of really brilliant people in there, and he was the one that actually kind of convinced me to try out that sort of split and the way it was kind of set up. Now I've changed it a little bit over the years, and now there's a 5-day. You can do it a 5-day if you want, but he kind of instilled those basic principles. And basically that's how the whole thing started, was doing that sort of split, that 4-day upper lower and then rest and upper lower. And that worked great. I mean, like I said, I was used to the typical bodybuilding splits, each body part one time a week, 8 to 12 reps, that sort of thing. And man, when I went on that, I got better gains in the first 12 weeks on that than I got in probably the year or two prior to that regular bodybuilding. I mean, that's when I went on that and stayed on that for like after about a year. That's when I started getting accused of using steroids because I got really good results from it because it was a properly periodized routine, and I got really strong from it, and it worked really, really well. Okay. So I was my first client. Yeah. I was my first client who had been on those typical bodybuilding splits, and I got some sense talked into me, switched over to something periodized, and made a lot of progress.
Okay, so maybe that's a decent starting point.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I wrote an article for teenage bodybuilders on bodybuilding.com, and that's exactly the split I recommended, actually. Okay. Because, if you're a beginner, sometimes it can be tough to get in, more than 4 days a week. So I think that's reasonable. Now, a lot of people, I'll get emails all the time, hey, can I change this? Can I change that? I mean, really, you can change up a lot of stuff with nonlinear periodization with the power hypertrophy training protocol. It's adaptive, but it's just those basic principles that early in the week you're doing basically powerlifting, and late in the week you're doing basically bodybuilding. I mean, those are the principles, and then you can, some people, like, for, let's say your legs are a strong point, but you've got your chest and back are weaknesses, but you've got good arms too. So maybe on your hypertrophy day, instead of having a really long upper body day, that by the time you get to your weak points, you're really tired. On your leg day, you also put your arms on that day as well. So you're working two strong points together that don't need a whole lot of volume. And now you've got more time, you can focus on your other upper body stuff. So you can always modify it that way as well. Okay. But yeah, it's very, I tell people, it's very modifiable, and you should modify it.
It's interesting because I remember reading a Charles Poliquin, I think it was a post on T-Nation, where someone was basically like, hey, I'm trying to put on as much muscle as fast as possible. What should I do? And Poliquin basically said, work out twice a day, and in the morning do like a powerlifting style workout, and then in the evening do like a hypertrophy, like 8-12 rep volume type of workout. And that was his advice for it. So
that's from the Bulgarians. I think a lot of Bulgarian literature, they train twice a day. I mean, when people talk to me about overtraining, I'll point into the Bulgarians who were like some of the first guys ever to squat 800 pounds raw, and they train twice a day and work up to a run rep max like almost every single time. Yep. And everybody would say that's overtraining, and yet somehow it works. You know what I mean? And then people say, well, those guys are on steroids. Well, yeah, but so are the guys who are recommending these typical bodybuilding splits, like, like the splits that are in all the magazines are, one body part per week. Well, those guys are on steroids too, so it's really, that's kind of a cop-out answer in terms of trying to explain why something is overtraining for the average person. I honestly think more people undertrain than they do overtrain, probably for fear of overtraining.
Yeah. Is there any telltale sign of overtraining? Is it just you start to break down your ability to squat because your nervous system is so fried?
Yeah, you would actually notice it psychologically before you'd probably notice it physically. You would just lose the... For you to get to the point where you'd actually be overtrained, you would actually already have had a very decreased amount of drive to train. You would be lethargic. You wouldn't want to go in to train. You'd be irritable. You might even get a little sick. That sort of thing. Your strength would go down, and in that case, maybe I'm overtrained, right? I'm getting tired. But in that case, I recommend for people to, structure in deloads. And deloads are basically, don't take a week off. A lot of people will go and they'll take a week off and they'll come back and they'll be better. But it wouldn't be as good as they just did a deload. Now, a deload allows you to actively recover and maintain those positive training adaptations. So you don't want to just completely stop lifting for a week or two because you'll lose a lot of the positive adaptations even if that short period of time. And so you wouldn't want to do what's called a deload. So I'll tell people, back off to if you're used to doing, let's say you squat 300 pounds for 10 reps. Mm-hmm. Well, do your normal routine, but instead of squatting 300 pounds, you're going to do 60% of what you normally do, 60 or 70% of what you normally do. So you're going to do, 200 pounds for 10 reps. And that's going to be an amount of weight that you don't have to get all jacked up for. But it's heavy enough that it's going to maintain your muscle, but it's light enough it's going to allow you some active recovery and for you to kind of get past that overtraining cycle. If you do that for 1, 2, very rarely would you ever need 3 weeks, but 3 weeks, you're going to notice that you'll be a lot better, and you'll know mostly when you're ready to go again because you'll start getting back that you'll be chomping at the bit to go heavy again. Yep.
Okay. All right. Cool. Layne, what's next for you, man? What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm about 10 days out from a pro powerlifting meet. I'm doing the Europa Super Show in Orlando. They have that's an IFBB Pro show, but they have a pro powerlifting meet attached to it. And I sent in my application, they accepted, so I'm going to do that. And so hopefully, I would love to be able to win money in powerlifting, and then say I've won money in bodybuilding and powerlifting because I feel like that'd be pretty cool. Yeah. So that's my big thing that's on the horizon for me. I've also, clients are starting to gear up for shows this year, so that's fresh in my mind. Doing quite a bit of traveling this year. I'm going to the New York Pro actually in May because I have a couple clients in that. And then my wife and I are putting on a natural bodybuilding VIP camp where we're flying in some of the best natural pros in the world and some of the top experts in the world to speak on training, nutrition to a group of people. These people paid a premium, but they are going to get basically access to the best in the world for a weekend. It's gonna be pretty cool for them.
That sounds really. Is that open to the public, or is that
it was open to the public for about 24 hours, and then we sold out all the slots.
Wow.
I made it available to my clients first, and they occupied everything but 4 slots, and then when we made it public, those 4 slots went pretty quick. But we do hopefully plan on making it an annual thing, and maybe one of these days we'll do something that's a little bit, it's tough because you've got to. I wanted to keep it personal, so that people could get a lot out of it. But I also wanted to be able to bring in the big names, which means it costs a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so, you have to charge kind of a premium to do that if you're going to keep the number of people down. And then the problem with bringing in, making it less expensive, but, making it so a lot of people can do it is a lot of people will sign up and it'll be 100 people, and it'll be more it won't be like that one-on-one interaction I really wanted to get. You know what I mean? So, yeah. But we do plan on making it annual. So next year, keep a lookout on my Facebook, on my website. Maybe you can grab one of those public slots next time it comes up if you guys are watching and you're interested. But that should be interesting for us, because eventually I think we'd like to promote a show, promote a natural pro show, and so like that's kind of not really a test of that, but it'll kind of be interesting to see how we can coordinate the logistics and those sort of things. We're already coming into trying to find venues and trying to find airfare and all this stuff, and just actually it's hard to imagine like what goes on to putting in a show. So the next time you do a bodybuilding show or a powerlifting meet, everybody, make sure you thank the promoter, because it's a tough job and it's a thankless job, because most time all you hear about is people complaining.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you got your work cut out for you, man.
Yeah, always.
And thanks so much for talking to us today. I'm sure that the people listening learned a lot. You dropped some little hints in there too that I thought were pretty cool. So
yeah, I hope everybody got a lot out of it. So I appreciate it, and hopefully I won't get too many hate messages over it.
All right, brother. Take care.
All right, man. Thank you.
All right. Hope you enjoyed that interview. As always, to hear more, go to bodyhack.com, click the link to the blog. And if you know anyone with a good story, maybe they lost a bunch of weight, maybe they really know what they're talking about, or they're doing some crazy thing that we'd probably be interested in, go ahead and send me an email, spencer@bodyhack.com. Until I see you guys next time, take care, have fun, train hard. That's it. Bye-bye.